They say the desert keeps secrets better than any man ever could. Buried beneath the glittering neon lights of Las Vegas, under the sand-swept highways that cut through Nevada's endless expanse, lie the bones of empires built on blood money and broken promises. And if you listen closely, real closely, you might still hear the whispers of a name that once made casino bosses tremble and federal agents wake up in cold sweats. Silver Jack Nolan, a ghost in a silver suit, a king without a crown, a man who turned the Nevada desert into his personal kingdom and the casinos into his counting houses. This is his story, raw, ruthless, and real. But before we descend into the shadows of his empire, take a moment to hit that like button. It helps us bring more stories like this from the dark corners of history. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Are you listening from New York at midnight? Los Angeles at sunset? Or maybe you're halfway across the world, drawn to these tales of American outlaws. Let us know. We love hearing from you. Now, let's begin. Every legend has a beginning. And Jack Nolan started in the least likely place you'd expect to breed a casino kingpin, the copper mining town of Butte, Montana, in 1923. Born to an Irish immigrant father who drank his wages and a mother who cleaned the houses of mine owners, Jack learned early that the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who dug in the dirt for pennies, and those who stayed clean while others got dirty. He chose neither. By 15, Jack had run away from the mining camps, hopping freight trains south with nothing but a deck of cards and a silver dollar his grandmother had given him before she died. "Keep this close," she'd whispered with her last breath. "Silver brings luck, but only if you never spend it." He wore that dollar on a chain around his neck for the rest of his life, even when he had millions. Even when he wore suits that cost more than his father earned in a year. The trains took him to Reno first, then to the sprawling, sun-scorched nothing of rural Nevada. This was the 1930s. The Depression had America by the throat, and Nevada was gasping for air like everywhere else. But Nevada had something other states didn't: legal gambling. It was new, raw, and wide open. The big boys from the East Coast hadn't fully moved in yet. There was still room for a clever kid with fast hands and a silver tongue. Jack spent 3 years, working every angle he could find. He dealt cards in backroom games. He ran numbers for local bookies. He drove bootleg liquor across state lines when Prohibition was still choking the nation. But more than anything, he watched. He studied the players, the bosses, the corrupt sheriffs. The way money moved like water through the desert always, flowing toward those who knew how to dig the right channels. By 1940, at just 22 years old, Jack Nolan had earned his nickname. He always wore silver tie clips, silver cufflinks, a silver watch, and later, those famous silver-gray suits that became his signature. Silver Jack, they called him. Some said it was because of his grandmother's lucky coin. Others said it was because he had a way of turning everything he touched into money, modern alchemy, desert style. But Jack wasn't satisfied being a small-timer. He'd seen the future, and the future was Las Vegas. In the early 1940s, Vegas was barely a town, just a railroad stop with a few casinos, some dusty motels, and big dreams. But Jack saw what others didn't. He saw the Hoover Dam bringing water and power. He saw the military installations popping up for the war effort, bringing soldiers with paychecks and appetites for vice. Most of all, he saw possibility, using money he'd saved and stolen. Jack bought his first piece of Vegas real estate in 1943, a small, run-down casino called the Silver Spur on the outskirts of Fremont Street. It wasn't much. 20 slot machines, 3 card tables, a bar that served watered-down whiskey. But it was his Jack ran the Silver Spur like a laboratory, experimenting with everything the bigger casinos weren't trying yet. He brought in prettier dealers, young women with bright smiles who kept players at the tables longer. He offered better odds than his competitors, knowing he'd make it back in volume. He extended credit to locals and tourists alike, keeping meticulous records of who owed what. And most importantly, he learned how to skim, the art of taking cash off the top before anyone official could count it. Within 2 years, the Silver Spur was printing money, but Jack Nolan wasn't built for contentment. He'd tasted power, and now he wanted more. He began buying up property along what would become the strip empty desert lots that people thought he was crazy for purchasing. He formed partnerships with shadowy investors from Chicago, New York, and Kansas City men with Italian surnames and quiet voices who appreciated Jack's efficiency and his silence. By 1947, Jack owned pieces of 4 casinos and had his fingers in a dozen others. He wasn't the public face, he was smarter than that. He let others take the spotlight while he operated from the shadows, pulling strings, moving money, making problems disappear. The war had ended. Soldiers were coming home. America was booming. And Las Vegas, Jack's Las Vegas, was about to explode. The ghost in the silver suit had arrived. The desert had its king, but kingdoms built on sand have a way of shifting beneath your feet. And Jack Nolan was about to learn that in the Nevada desert, the higher you rise, the farther you have to fall. The game had only just begun. If you wanted to understand how Silver Jack Nolan built his empire, you had to understand one fundamental truth in Las Vegas. The house always wins, unless you are the house. By 1950, Las Vegas was transforming. The Flamingo, financed by Bugsy Siegel's mob money, had proven that luxury resorts could work in the desert. The El Rancho Vegas and the Last Frontier were pulling in tourists from California. The city was shedding its cowboy image and putting on an evening gown, and Jack Nolan was right there, threading himself through every seam of the transformation. His masterpiece was a casino called the Mirage Palace, and before you think of the modern Mirage that stands today, understand that Jack's version came first, though it's been erased from official histories. Buried beneath layers of demolition, reconstruction, and deliberately forgotten paperwork, the Mirage Palace opened in December 1951 on what would later become the heart of the Strip. It was beautiful in that dangerous, seductive way Vegas has always specialized in, all chrome and glass, with a massive fountain out front that seemed impossible in the desert heat. Inside, the carpets were thick, the chandeliers sparkled, and the dealers wore crisp uniforms with, you guessed it, silver trim. But the Mirage Palace wasn't just another casino. It was Jack's declaration of independence, his middle finger to both the mob bosses who thought they owned Vegas and the legitimate businessmen who looked down on the gambling trade. Jack had structured the ownership through a maze of shell companies, holding corporations, and silent partners. On paper, he owned only 15%. In reality, he controlled everything. The genius of Jack's operation wasn't what happened on the casino floor, It was what happened beneath it, in the basement of the Mirage Palace. Jack built the counting room, and not just any counting room. This was a fortress. Steel-reinforced walls, time-locked vault doors, armed guards who worked in shifts and never spoke to each other. But most importantly, Jack installed a second set of books. Here's how the skim worked. Every night, before the official count, Jack's most trusted men would pull cash from the drop boxes, maybe 10%, maybe 15%, depending on how good the night had been. This money never made it into the official ledgers. It was packed into leather satchels, driven out into the desert in unmarked cars, and distributed to Jack's network of investors' mob families in Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, Cleveland. The beauty of it, everyone got paid. The legitimate shareholders got their dividends based on the official numbers. The silent partners got their skin. And Jack took his cut from both sides. He was the middleman in his own casino, and he was making a fortune. But Jack Nolan wasn't just a thief, he was an innovator. While other casinos were still operating like glorified saloons, Jack was thinking bigger. He brought in top-shelf entertainment, convincing jazz singers and comedians from New York to perform in his showroom. He offered complimentary rooms, meals, drinks to high rollers, knowing the goodwill would pay off at the tables. He even pioneered the eye-in-the-sky system, installing hidden cameras above the casino floor to catch dealers and players cheating. Some say Jack invented the modern Las Vegas casino model. He'd probably agree that by 1954, the Mirage Palace was the most profitable casino in Nevada, pulling in over $15 million a year, and that was just the money they were admitting to. The real number? Jack took that secret to his grave, but success in Vegas draws attention like blood draws sharks. The FBI was starting to sniff around, particularly J. Edgar Hoover's Organized Crime Task Force. They knew the mob had infiltrated Vegas. What they didn't know was how deep. Jack's name kept appearing in surveillance reports, always in the background, never quite in focus. He was a ghost in silver, always present but never quite catchable. Then there was the Nevada Gaming Control Board, established in 1955 to clean up the casino industry. Suddenly, operators needed licenses. Backgrounds were checked. Financial records were scrutinized. The Wild West days were ending, and regulation was coming to the desert. Jack adapted. He always did. He hired lawyers the best money could buy. He made strategic donations to political campaigns. He joined civic organizations and sponsored local charities. He became, at least on the surface, respectable. The ghost in the silver suit learned to wear a mask of legitimacy, but beneath the surface, the skim continued. The money flowed. The empire grew. Jack opened 2 more casinos, the Silver Star and the Desert, Crown using front men to hold the licenses while he pulled the strings. He bought hotels, restaurants, a car dealership, and huge tracts of desert land that would be worth billions today. He invested in legitimate businesses to launder the casino money construction companies, trucking firms, a small airline. By 1958, Silver Jack Nolan was one of the richest men in Nevada, though most people had never heard his name. He owned a mansion in the hills above Vegas with a view of the entire strip, his kingdom, spread out before him like a glittering promise. He drove a silver Cadillac Eldorado with custom leather interior. He wore watches that cost more than houses. He had a wife, a former showgirl named Diane, and 2 children who attended private schools in California. Far from their father's world. From the outside, Jack Nolan had won. He'd beaten the odds, conquered the desert, built an empire from nothing. But as Jack stood on his balcony at night, smoking Cuban cigars and watching the neon lights pulse below, he must have felt it, that tremor beneath his feet, that sense that the sand was shifting, that the wheel was still spinning. And in Vegas, the wheel always keeps spinning, because empires built on stolen money and hidden partnerships have a fatal flaw. Too many people know the truth, and in Jack's world, people who knew too much had a way of becoming problems. The cracks were starting to show. There's a story they tell in the old bars on Fremont Street, the ones that survived urban renewal and corporate takeovers, the ones where dealers and pit bosses drink after their shifts end. It's a story about Silver Jack Nolan, and it's become the stuff of Vegas legend. They call it the Night of the Four Kings. It was July 1956, right in the middle of Jack's golden era. A high-stakes poker game had been arranged at the Mirage Palace, the kind of game that wasn't advertised, that required connections just to hear about. The buy-in was $50,000, an astronomical sum at the time. 4 players sat at the table, each representing a different power center in the American underworld. There was Sal, the banker Marconi from Chicago, a money man for the outfit who could count cards like a machine and never showed emotion. There was Raymond Cruz from Los Angeles, a smooth-talking operator who controlled the flow of illegal goods across the Mexican border. There was Leo Wasserman, a legitimate businessman, or as legitimate as anyone could be in Vegas, who owned a chain of hotels and wanted into the casino business. And then there was Silver Jack himself, sitting at his own table, in his own casino, playing against men who could destroy him if they chose to. The game lasted 14 hours, witnesses, and there were only a handful. All sworn to silence, said it was the most intense poker game anyone had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved across the table. Jack played with his characteristic coolness, his face unreadable behind a cloud of cigar smoke, that silver dollar visible at his throat. By dawn, 3 of the men were broke or close to it. Jack had won over $200,000, but here's where the story gets interesting, and where fact blurs into legend. Sal Marconi, humiliated and furious, accused Jack of cheating. Now, you didn't accuse a casino owner of cheating in his own establishment, especially not in 1950s Vegas. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. The room went silent. Jack's security men tensed. Everyone expected violence. Instead, Jack smiled. He stood up, walked to the window, and gestured at the dawn breaking over Las Vegas. Then he said something that became part of his legend. "Gentlemen, the house always wins. But I'm not the house. I'm the man who built the house. There is a difference. You came to my table. You played my game. You lost. That's not cheating. That's just Vegas." Then he did something extraordinary. He took the $200,000 he'd won, split it 4 ways, and gave 3/4 of it back to the losers. He kept only his original stake plus a modest profit. "I don't need your money," he reportedly said. "I need your respect. And now I have it." The 4 men left as friends, or at least not as enemies. and the story of Jack's gesture spread through the underworld like wildfire. Here was a man who could have taken everything but chose to be generous. Here was a man who understood that in a world of thieves and killers, reputation was worth more than cash. It was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, because what Jack had actually done was buy himself protection. Those three men became his allies, his insulation against threats from rival organizations. Sal Marconi made sure the Chicago outfit knew Jack was not to be touched. Raymond Cruz ensured smooth operations on the West Coast. Leo Wasserman became a business partner, lending legitimacy to Jack's operations for the price of $150,000 money he'd stolen from his own casino anyway. Jack had purchased something priceless: immunity. But not all of Jack's legend was built on generosity. There were darker stories too, whispered tales that carried the weight of truth, like the story of Tommy the Crow Delano, a dealer at the Mirage Palace who got greedy. Tommy had figured out the skim and decided he wanted a piece for himself. He started skimming the skim-taking money after Jack's men had already taken theirs. It wasn't much, maybe $500 a week, but in Jack's operation, loyalty was everything. When Jack found out, he didn't call the police. He didn't even get angry. He invited Tommy to dinner at a steakhouse Jack owned, just the two of them. They ate expensive cuts of beef, drank fine wine, talked about Tommy's family, his wife, his two young daughters. Jack was charming, understanding, almost paternal. At the end of the meal, Jack slid an envelope across the table. Inside was $5,000, every penny Tommy had stolen, plus interest. "You're done in Vegas," Jack said quietly. "Take your family and leave. Tonight, if I see you in this city after sunrise, I'll kill you myself." Tommy Delano was on a bus to Oklahoma before midnight. He never returned to Nevada. That was Jack's method, calculated mercy that sent a message. He'd spare you once, but only once. And everyone knew it. Then there were the disappearances. Over the years of Jack's reign, several men who'd crossed him or knew too much simply vanished. A skimming partner who threatened to go to the feds. A rival casino owner who tried to muscle in on Jack's territory. A showgirl who'd seen something she shouldn't have and talked about it to the wrong person. The desert is vast, and it keeps secrets well. There's a rumor impossible to verify, but persistent, that Jack owned a piece of land 50 miles outside Vegas. A dry lake bed where the ground was soft enough to dig in and remote enough that no one ever went there. They called it the Silver Mine, though no silver had ever been mined there. Some say a dozen bodies are buried in that dust. Some say more. Jack never confirmed or denied these stories. In fact, his silence on the subject was its own kind of confession. When asked directly by a journalist in 1959 about the men who disappeared, Jack simply smiled and said, "In Vegas, people come and go. That's the nature of the town. Some people find their fortune here. Others find what they deserve." The journalist didn't ask a follow-up question. By the end of the 1950s, Silver Jack Nolan's legend had transcended the man himself. He was Vegas, the promise and the threat, the glamour and the darkness, the dream and the nightmare. People feared him. People respected him. People wanted to be him, but legends are dangerous things. They attract attention. They invite challenges. They make men believe they're invincible. And in Jack's case, They painted a target on his back that was growing larger by the day. Someone was coming for the king. There are crimes that get you arrested, crimes that get you killed, and crimes that get you legendary. What Silver Jack Nolan pulled off in the spring of 1957 was the third kind of heist so audacious, so perfectly executed, and so profitable that even the men he stole from had to admire it. They called it many things over the years: the Stardust Job, the Silver Switch, the Weekend Vegas Forgot. But those who really knew what happened called it what it was: the greatest casino robbery in American history. And the beautiful thing, it wasn't even Jack's casino he robbed. Let me take you back to March 1957. Jack was riding high. The Mirage Palace was printing money. His other properties were thriving, and he'd successfully positioned himself as the quiet power behind multiple Vegas operations. But Jack had a problem, and that problem's name was Vincent "Vinny" Diamonds. Costlow. Vinny was a Chicago outfit heavy who'd muscled his way into Vegas. With a suitcase full of mob money and plans to open a rival casino called the Stardust Palace. Vinny was crude where Jack was smooth, violent where Jack was calculating. And worst of all, he'd been trying to poach Jack's best dealers, his entertainment contacts, even his suppliers. Vinny saw Jack's success and wanted to replicate it, but without Jack's patience or finesse. The disrespect bothered Jack more than the competition. In their world, there were rules. You didn't step on another man's territory without permission. You didn't try to steal his operation piece by piece. Vinny was doing both, and he was doing it with a smirk that said he didn't think Silver Jack would do anything about it. Vinny was wrong. The Stardust Palace opened on March 15, 1957. With a weekend-long celebration that tried to outdo anything Vegas had ever seen. Vinny had spared no expense. He'd imported entertainers from New York, offered unprecedented gambling limits, and most importantly, bragged publicly about the $2 million in cash he'd stocked in the casino cage to handle the expected high roller action. $2 million. In 1957, that's roughly $20 million in today's money, all sitting in one place. Behind vault doors that Vinny assured everyone were impenetrable. Jack heard about the $2 million and smiled. Not a friendly smile. The smile of a shark that's just spotted blood in the water. Here's what most people don't understand about casino heists. They're nearly impossible to pull off from the outside. The security is too tight, the cameras too numerous, the guards too alert. Every amateur thief in America has fantasized about robbing a Vegas casino, and every single one who tried ended up either dead or in prison. But Jack wasn't robbing from the outside. He was going to rob the Stardust from the inside, and he was going to make Vinny Diamonds help him do it. The plan took 3 weeks to set up, and it required a level of coordination that would have impressed a military general. Jack assembled a team of 7 people, each with a specific role, each carefully chosen for their skills and their ability to keep their mouths shut. There was Marcus Webb, a former Army demolitions expert who'd done time for safe cracking and now worked as Jack's special consultant on security matters. There was Lily Chun, a stunning Chinese-American woman who could make any man forget his own name and, more importantly, his professional duties. There was Bobby "Sketch" Marino, a master forger who could replicate anything from driver's licenses to treasury bonds. There was Frank Delacroix, a locksmith so skilled he'd once opened a bank vault using only a stethoscope and a hairpin. And there were 3 others men whose names Jack never revealed, not even when questioned later, because that was the code dot. The first phase of the operation began 2 weeks before the heist. Lily Chun accidentally bumped into Harold Tucker, the Stardust's head of security, at a bar on Fremont Street. Harold was a former cop, 42 years old, married with 3 kids, and according to Jack's research, deeply unhappy with both his marriage and his salary. Lily was everything Harold's life wasn't: exciting, dangerous, attentive, and seemingly fascinated by everything he said. Within 3 days, Harold was buying her expensive dinners. Within a week, he was telling her things about his job, the security protocols, the shift schedules, the weaknesses in the system that his bosses refused to fix because they were too cheap. Harold thought he was impressing a beautiful woman. He had no idea he was handing Silver Jack Nolan the blueprints to rob his casino. Meanwhile, Bobby Sketch Marino was working on credentials. He created fake Nevada Gaming Commission identification cards for 2 of Jack's team members, complete with photographs, official seals, and serial numbers that would check out if anyone bothered to verify them, which, in the chaos of opening weekend, nobody would. Frank Delacroix spent his time studying the locks on the Stardust service entrances. He dressed as a delivery driver, a maintenance worker, a food inspector, any disguise that let him get close to the doors and memorize their mechanisms. Frank had a photographic memory for locks. He claimed he could hear the tumblers in his sleep. And Jack? Jack did what he did best. He watched. He analyzed. He found the angles. He discovered that the Stardust's main vault had a secondary entrance, a service corridor that connected to the counting room and was used to transport cash without having to go through the main casino floor. Smart design, but it meant there was a second point of entry. And unlike the main vault door with its time locks and multiple guards, the service corridor was protected by just 2 men on rotating shifts. Jack also learned something crucial from one of his suppliers. Vinnie Diamonds had cut corners on the vault installation. He'd gone with a cheaper model than recommended, and he'd skipped several security upgrades because he wanted to pocket the difference. Vinnie's greed was going to be his downfall. The heist was set for Saturday, March 30th, 1957, 2 weeks after opening, when the Stardust would still be packed with tourists and high rollers, when the cage would still be fully stocked, but when the staff would be exhausted enough to be less vigilant. It started at 2:17 p.m., during the busiest time in any casino late afternoon, when the day shift was ending and the night shift was beginning, when the floor was crowded, when confusion was natural. 2 men in Nevada Gaming Commission uniforms walked into the Stardust through the main entrance, briefcases in hand, looking official and bored. They flashed their credentials to the floor manager and explained they were there for a routine inspection of cash handling procedures, something that happened regularly enough that nobody questioned it. The floor manager, eager to look cooperative, personally escorted them to the counting room. This was the beautiful part of Jack's plan. They weren't sneaking in. They were being invited in, while the fake inspectors were creating a legitimate distraction in the counting room, asking questions, examining procedures, taking notes. Frank Delacroix was entering through the service corridor. He'd gotten past the exterior door in 45 seconds, moving so smoothly that the security camera, which Lily had learned, from Harold was often not being actively monitored during shift changes, barely caught his shadow. Corridor led to a door marked Authorized Personnel. Only the entrance to the vault area. Frank had studied this lock for 2 weeks. He'd built a replica in Jack's warehouse and practiced on it until he could open it blindfolded. Now, with steady hands and absolute confidence, he worked his picks while Marcus Webb stood watch. 3 minutes. That's all it took Frank to open a door that Vinnie Diamonds thought was impregnable. Asterisk inside. They found exactly what Jack's intelligence had promised, the vault room. And more importantly, the shift change happening between the day and evening security teams. 4 guards instead of 2. All clustered near the time clock, talking, laughing. Distracted. This is where the plan got dangerous. Marcus stepped into the room first. And in his hand was not a gun. Jack had been explicit about no weapons. No violence, but something far more effective. A badge. A real FBI badge. One that Marcus had acquired years ago and that Jack had been saving for exactly this kind of moment. FBI, Marcus said calmly, holding up the badge. Nobody move. This is a federal investigation. The guards froze. This was 1957. The FBI was cracking down on organized crime, and everyone in Vegas knew it. The possibility that federal agents might walk into a casino unannounced wasn't just plausible. It was expected. We have reason to believe this establishment is operating as a front for money laundering, Marcus continued in a voice that dripped authority. We're seizing cash for evidence. You 4 are going to sit quietly in that corner while we document everything. If any of you interfere with a federal investigation, you'll be charged with obstruction. Is that clear? The guards looked at each other. They were casino security, not heroes. And they'd all heard stories about what happened to people who crossed the FBI. They sat down. Frank moved to the vault door while Marcus kept the guards covered, not with a gun, with that badge and pure bluff. The vault itself was the tricky part. It had a combination lock that required 2 people to open 2 combinations that had to be entered simultaneously. In theory, this made it impossible for a single thief to access, but Frank Delacroix wasn't a single thief, and he wasn't relying on combinations. From his bag, he pulled out a device that Marcus had built, electromagnetic pulse generator. Crude by modern standards, but cutting edge for 1957. The theory was simple. Hit the lock solenoid with enough electromagnetic interference, and it might disengage. Frank placed the device against the lock, nodded to Marcus, and activated it. Nothing happened. One of the guards smirked. You FBI boys don't know what you're. The lock clicked. The vault door swung open. Sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes the universe rewards audacity. And sometimes Vinnie Diamonds' decision to buy the cheap vault instead of the good one comes back to haunt him. Inside the vault were stacks of cash organized in neat bundles, mostly hundreds and fifties, with some 20s mixed in. This was the casino's operating capital, the money that kept the tables running, the cage stocked, the wheels spinning. $2 million in small, used, non-sequential bills. Beautiful. Frank and Marcus worked with practiced efficiency. They had brought 4 duffel bags large, nondescript, the kind delivery men used. They filled them methodically, taking money from different stacks to make the theft less immediately obvious. They weren't emptying the vault that would have triggered immediate alarms. They were taking approximately $750,000, enough to hurt Vinny badly, but not enough to completely shut down his operation. Jack had calculated this precisely. Take too much, and Vinny would have to close the casino and report it to authorities. Take just enough, and Vinny would have to absorb the loss quietly rather than admit to the Nevada Gaming Commission that his impregnable vault had been breached on opening weekend. While this was happening, the two fake inspectors were still in the counting room, still asking questions, still providing cover. The whole operation, from Frank picking the corridor lock to the FAO vault being closed again, took 11 minutes. 11 minutes to steal $750,000. Marcus and Frank walked out of the vault room, bags in hand, past guards who were still sitting obediently in the corner. Marcus paused at the door and said, "You gentlemen stay here for 15 minutes. Don't touch anything. Don't call anyone. We're sealing this room as evidence. If we find out you've tampered with anything, you'll be accessories to federal crimes." Understood. The guards nodded. What else could they do? Marcus and Frank walked down the service corridor, out the door, and into a laundry truck that was waiting in the alley driven by one of Jack's unnamed team members. The bags went into laundry carts covered with dirty linens. To anyone watching, it was just a routine pickup from the casino's laundry service. The fake inspectors concluded their inspection 10 minutes later, thanked the floor manager for his cooperation, and walked out the front door with their briefcases. They got into a taxi driven by another team member and disappeared into Vegas. Traffic. By the time the vault was officially accessed for the evening count, almost an hour had passed. The first accountant who noticed the money was missing probably thought he'd miscounted. Then he counted again. Then he called his supervisor. Then his supervisor called his supervisor. By 6 p.m., someone finally worked up the courage to tell Vinny Diamonds that his casino had been robbed. Vinny's reaction was memorable. According to witnesses, he put his fist through a wall, smashed a lamp, and screamed so loudly that guests in the casino could hear him through soundproof doors. But then, as his rage cooled into something more dangerous, he made a decision. He wasn't going to report it. Think about it from Vinny's perspective. He'd just opened his casino 2 weeks ago. He'd bragged publicly about his security. He'd assured his Chicago backers that their investment was safe. Now he had to admit that $750,000 mob money had vanished from under his nose, stolen by men who'd walked in dressed as federal agents and convinced his guards to sit quietly while they robbed the vault. If that story got out, Vinny would be a laughingstock. Worse, he'd be seen as incompetent. In the mob, incompetence gets you killed. So Vinny ate the loss. He told his backers there had been unexpected operating expenses. He fired the 4 security guards and Harold Tucker, giving them enough severance to ensure their silence. He installed new locks, new protocols, new everything. And he quietly, desperately tried to figure out who had done it. He never looked at Silver Jack Nolan. Why would he? Jack had his own casinos. Jack had no reason to rob a competitor. And Jack had been visible all day Saturday, hosting a golf tournament at a course he owned, surrounded by witnesses who would swear he never left. The perfect alibi. Being somewhere else entirely while your team executes the crime. The money was laundered through Jack's network over the next 6 months, small amounts moved through legitimate businesses, offshore accounts, shell corporations. Jack took his cut, about 200,000, and divided the rest among his team and his Chicago partners, who'd provided some of the initial intelligence about the Stardust's vulnerabilities. But the money was never the point. Not really. The point was the message. In the world Jack operated in, reputation was everything. Vinnie Diamonds had disrespected him, and Jack had responded by making Vinnie look like a fool. Within weeks, the story had leaked, not the details, but enough. Word spread through the underworld that someone had robbed the Stardust during opening weekend and gotten away clean. Speculation ran wild. Some said it was an inside job. Some said it was East Coast mobsters sending a message. A few suspected Jack, but nobody could prove anything. Vinnie's reputation never recovered. The Chicago outfit lost confidence in him. By 1959, he was out of Vegas entirely, transferred to some minor operation in Kansas City where he couldn't embarrass anyone important. The Stardust Palace itself was sold to new owners who didn't know about the heist and wondered why the security was so paranoid. And Jack? Jack never admitted to anything. Not to his closest associates, not to Diane. Not even to Danny Roth until years later, when they were both drunk and Danny finally asked point blank if the rumors were true. Jack had just smiled and said, "The best crimes are the ones nobody can prove happened." But there was one more twist to the story, one that didn't come out until the 1980s. When Lily Chun finally told the writer about her role in the operation. Remember Harold Tucker, the security chief who'd been fired after the heist? Lily had felt guilty about using him. Yes, it was part of the job, but Harold had been genuinely kind to her, and she'd destroyed his career. So she'd gone to Jack and asked him to do something. Jack, in his own strange way, had a code. A week after the heist, Harold Tucker received an anonymous envelope containing $10,000 in cash and a note that read, "Your family deserves better than Vegas. Use this to start over somewhere clean." Harold took the money, moved his family to Oregon, and opened a hardware store. He never worked in casinos again, and according to his children interviewed decades later, he never spoke about his time in Vegas, but supposedly, until the day he died in 1989, he kept that anonymous note in his wallet. Some crimes are about greed. Some are about desperation. But the best crimes, the legendary ones, are about style. They're about proving you're smarter than everyone else. About sending a message that echoes through the years. About doing the impossible and walking away untouched. The Stardust heist was Jack Nolan at his absolute peak. Brilliant, bold, and untouchable. It was the crime that cemented his legend. The job that made even his enemies respect him. The perfect execution of an impossible plan. It was also the beginning of his downfall, though he didn't know it yet. Because the thing about perfect crimes is that they make you believe you're invincible. They make you think you can keep getting away with it forever. They make you overconfident. And in Vegas, overconfidence is the deadliest sin of all. Years later, when the feds finally caught up with Jack, when Danny Roth was singing like a canary and the evidence was piling up, Jack's lawyers begged him to cut a deal. They said he could reduce his sentence significantly if he gave up information about unsolved crimes, including the Stardust heist. Jack refused. He went to prison for 25 years rather than admit to the greatest robbery in Vegas history. Some said it was pride. Some said it was loyalty to his team. But those who knew Jack best understood the real reason. Legends don't confess. They let the mystery live forever. And so the Stardust heist remains officially unsolved. The FBI still has a file on it. True crime writers still speculate about it. And somewhere in the records of American criminal history, there's a gap where the truth should be, a gap shaped exactly like a man in a silver suit, holding a silver dollar, smiling that dangerous smile. Asterisk, the ghost in the silver suit had struck, and Vegas would never be quite the same. The 1960s arrived in Las Vegas like a showgirl stepping into a spotlight, all glamour and promise, hiding the desperation underneath. For Silver Jack Nolan, the new decade should have been his coronation. Instead, it became the beginning of his unraveling. Jack was at the peak of his power. The Mirage Palace, the Silver Star, and the Desert Crown were all running at maximum capacity. The Rat Pack Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr. had made Vegas the entertainment capital of the world, and tourists were flooding in from everywhere. Money flowed through Jack's casinos like a river after a storm, but the landscape was changing. And not in Jack's favor. Howard Hughes billionaire, recluse. Madman had moved into the Desert Inn in 1966 and decided he wanted to own Las Vegas. He started buying casinos, paying cash, asking no questions about previous ownership or mob connections. Hughes represented something Jack had never faced before: legitimate money on a scale that dwarfed even the mob's resources. The corporations were coming. Wall Street was looking at Vegas and seeing profit potential. The days of independent operators and shadowy partnerships were numbered. Then there was the Nevada Gaming Commission, which had evolved from toothless watchdog into a genuine threat. They were getting better at tracking money, at uncovering hidden ownership, at connecting the dots between Vegas casinos and organized crime. In 1963, they'd published the Black Book, a list of individuals banned from every casino in Nevada due to mob connections. Jack's name wasn't in it yet, but he could feel the noose tightening. His partners were getting nervous. The mob families who'd profited from the skim for years were now seeing diminishing returns and increasing risks. Federal authorities were using wiretaps, financial forensics, and informants to build RICO cases. Several of Jack's associates in other cities had been indicted, and the fear was that someone would flip, would trade testimony for a lighter sentence. Jack responded the way he always had, by adapting. He started pulling back from day-to-day operations, installing more layers between himself and the illegal activities. He brought in professional managers with clean records to run his casinos. He created even more complex corporate structures. Shells within shells within shells. He also started planning his exit strategy. But first, there was the matter of the Oasis. In 1964, Jack announced plans for his most ambitious project, yet a casino resort unlike anything Vegas had ever seen. The Oasis would cover 20 acres on the Strip, featuring 2,000 hotel rooms, 5 restaurants, an Olympic-sized swimming pool with artificial waves, and the largest casino floor in the world. The price tag, $30 million. It was insane. It was visionary. It was pure Jack Nolan, but financing the Oasis proved problematic. Jack's traditional mob investors were reluctant to commit that much money when the feds were circling. Legitimate lenders wouldn't touch Jack because of his reputation. He needed a new source of capital, someone who could provide millions without asking too many questions. He found it in Anton Volkov, a mysterious businessman who'd arrived in Vegas from Europe in 1963. Volkov was smooth, sophisticated, and cash-rich. He claimed to represent European investors interested in American casino properties. Jack didn't ask too many questions, mainly because Volkov was offering $15 million at favorable terms. Construction on the Oasis began in 1965 for 2 years. It was the talk of Vegas, a massive construction site that promised to redefine luxury gaming. Jack was personally involved in every detail, from the color of the carpets to the configuration of the slot machines. This was going to be his legacy, the thing that would cement his place in Vegas history. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. Volkov's money, it turned out, was dirty, possibly dirtier than anything Jack had ever touched. Later investigations would suggest it came from a smuggling operation that moved everything from narcotics to weapons. The FBI had been tracking Volkov since his arrival, and now they were tracking Jack too. Worse, Volkov wanted control. He'd structured the loans so that if Jack missed payments, ownership of not just the Oasis but the Mirage, Palace, and Jack's other properties would transfer to Volkov's shell companies. Jack had been outplayed at his own game, and he didn't realize it until it was too late. Then came the personal costs. Diane, Jack's wife of 15 years, had finally had enough. She'd turned a blind eye to the violence, the crime, the late nights, and dangerous associates. But when their daughter, Elizabeth, was approached by FBI agents at her college in California and questioned about her father's activities, Diane drew a line. In 1966, she filed for divorce. The settlement was brutal. Jack had to give her the mansion, a significant cash payout, and trust funds for both children. More painful than the money was the loss itself. Despite everything, Jack had loved Diane, and she'd been one of the few people who'd known the real man behind the silver suit. The divorce made headlines. Silver Jack Nolan's wife flees Vegas empire, read one tabloid. The story painted Jack as a mobster, a criminal, everything he'd worked so hard to conceal behind his veneer of legitimacy. His reputation was cracking. His empire was bleeding money. His enemies were closing in. But Jack Nolan hadn't survived in Vegas for 25 years by giving up. In 1967, he made a desperate gamble. He decided to finish the Oasis no matter what it took. He took out additional loans, mortgaging everything he owned. He pushed the construction crews to work 24 hours a day. He spent money he didn't have on entertainment bookings and marketing campaigns. The Oasis opened in December 1967 with a star-studded gala that made international news. Frank Sinatra performed. Hollywood celebrities filled the rooms. High rollers packed the tables. For one glorious night, it seemed like Jack had pulled off another miracle. But the numbers didn't lie. The Oasis was magnificent, but it was also bleeding cash. The overhead was too high. The debt service was crushing. And worst of all, Volkov was demanding his money plus interest with increasing aggression. Jack had built his house of cards too high, and now the slightest wind threatened to bring it all crashing down. In early 1968, sitting alone in his office at the Mirage Palace, no longer living in his mansion, no longer surrounded by family, no longer secure in his kingdom. Jack Nolan must have realized a truth that every gambler eventually learns. Sometimes the house doesn't win. Asterisk, the end was coming. The question was whether Jack would fall or jump. There's a moment in every gangster's story, that precise instant when the trajectory changes, when the rise becomes a fall, when the throne becomes an electric chair. For Silver Jack Nolan, that moment came on a scorching afternoon in August 1968, in the most unexpected way possible. A knock on his office door. Nothing unusual about that, but the man who entered was Danny Roth, Jack's right-hand man for over 15 years. Danny had been there since the early days at the Silver Spur. He'd helped build the skim operation. He'd driven into the desert when bodies needed burying. He was the closest thing Jack had to a brother. Danny looked sick, pale, sweating in a way that had nothing to do with the desert heat. "We need to talk," Danny said. Privately. What Danny revealed in that conversation would shatter everything. The FBI had picked him up 3 weeks earlier, showed him photographs of transactions, played him recordings of conversations they'd captured through wiretaps. They had everything, details of the skim, evidence of the mob connections, documentation of financial crimes stretching back a decade. They were building a RICO case that would send Danny to prison for the rest of his life. Unless he cooperated, Danny was going to be an informant. He'd already given them some information, enough to secure immunity for himself. Now he was giving Jack a choice: disappear before the indictments come down, or face decades in federal prison. "They're coming for you, Jack," Danny said, and there were tears in his eyes. "Not tomorrow, not next month, but soon. They're going to seize everything, the casinos, the properties, your bank accounts. They're going to destroy you." Jack sat very still. He didn't rage. He didn't threaten. He just looked at the man he trusted with his life and his secrets, and he asked one question: "Why are you telling me this?" "Because despite everything," Danny said, "you gave me a life. You pulled me out of nothing. I owe you enough to give you this warning. But Jack, I can't go to prison. I just can't." After Danny left, Jack sat in his office for hours, smoking cigar after cigar, watching the sun set over his kingdom. He thought about his grandmother's silver dollar, still hanging around his neck after all these years. He thought about the kid from Butte who'd hopped a freight train with nothing but a deck of cards and a dream. He thought about everything he'd built, and everything he was about to lose. The betrayal wasn't just Danny. It was everywhere. Closing in from all sides, Anton Volkov had disappeared. One day he was in Vegas making demands. The next he was gone back to Europe, rumor said, leaving Jack holding millions in debt with no way to repay. The Oasis was drowning in red ink. Banks were calling in loans. Suppliers were demanding payment. The mob families who'd once protected Jack were now distancing themselves. When Jack reached out to Sal Marconi in Chicago, the man whose respect he'd bought 12 years earlier with a poker game gesture, Sal wouldn't take his calls. The message was clear: "You're radioactive. We're cutting you loose." Even Jack's legitimate business partners were bailing. Leo Wasserman sold his shares in the Silver Star at a loss and publicly stated he'd had no knowledge of any illegal activities. Lawyers who'd represented Jack for years suddenly had conflicts of interest. Accountants who'd managed his books claimed they'd just been following orders. Jack was alone. truly alone. Maybe for the first time since he'd arrived in Nevada 30 years earlier. But Jack Nolan hadn't built an empire by accepting defeat easily. If he was going down, he'd go down fighting, or better yet, he'd disappear on his own terms. In September 1968, Jack started liquidating assets. He sold his remaining shares in the Desert Crown to a corporate buyer for pennies on the dollar. He transferred the Mirage Palace to a holding company in preparation for a fire sale. He converted everything he could into cash and offshore accounts. The vultures were circling, but Jack was determined they'd get as little as possible. He also began collecting his own insurance policy documents, recordings, photographs that implicated his former partners in crimes ranging from fraud to murder. If he was going down, he'd have leverage. The threat of mutual destruction might be enough to buy him exile instead of a prison cell. Then came November 14, 1968, a date etched into Vegas lore. Jack threw one last party at the Oasis. He invited everyone: high rollers, entertainers, politicians, journalists, and a few select underworld figures who still had the courage to be seen with him. The casino comped everything: the food, the drinks, the rooms. It was awake, though nobody said it out loud. Jack gave a speech that night, standing in the center of his magnificent casino, wearing one of his signature silver suits. He raised a glass of champagne and said, "This city was built by dreamers and bastards, by men who saw beauty in the desert and profit in sin. I've been both dreamer and bastard. I've won, I've lost, I've built, I've destroyed. But I've never apologized for what I am." Vegas doesn't want apologies. It wants spectacle. So here's to the spectacle of it all. Here's to the house, which always wins in the end, even when that house is built on sand. The crowd erupted in applause. People who knew this was goodbye applauded the hardest. Jack left the Oasis at 3 in the morning, driving his silver Cadillac alone into the desert. Some say he went to the silver mine, that mythical burial ground, to say goodbye to the ghosts. Others claim he met with someone, though who it was has never been confirmed. What is known is that he returned to the Mirage Palace at dawn, went to his office, and started burning documents. His secretary arrived at 9 a.m. to find him still there, surrounded by ashes, his silver suit wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. "Call my lawyer," he told her. "Tell him I'm ready to talk about my options." But before the lawyer could arrive, federal agents raided the Mirage Palace. They came with warrants for Jack's arrest, for seizure of financial records, for interrogation of staff. The casino was locked down. Guests were evacuated. The gaming tables fell silent. Jack was arrested in his own office, handcuffed by agents who'd been building their case for years. They read him his rights, but Jack barely listened. He was watching through his office window as FBI accountants carried boxes of records out of his casino, as his empire was systematically dismantled before his eyes. As they led him out through the casino floor, past the slot machines he'd chosen, under the chandeliers he'd installed, across the carpets he'd designed, Jack Nolan managed to smile. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who'd always known this moment would come, who'd just hoped to outrun it a little longer. "The house always wins," he murmured to himself. But this time, Jack wasn't the house. He was just another player who'd bet too much and lost. Asterisk, the king was falling. But he still had one card left to play. The trial of Jackson Silver Jack Nolan began in federal court in Las Vegas on March 3, 1969, and it became the legal spectacle of the decade. The courthouse was packed every day with journalists, curious tourists, underworld figures keeping tabs on what might be revealed, and FBI agents who'd spent years building this case. The charges were extensive: racketeering, tax evasion, wire fraud, illegal skimming operations, money laundering, and conspiracy. If convicted on all counts, Jack faced over 60 years in federal prison. At 46 years old, that was effectively a life sentence. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had Danny Roth's testimony detailing the skim operation in precise detail. They had financial records showing millions in unreported income. They had wiretap recordings of Jack discussing illegal activities with mob associates. They had canceled checks, property records, testimonies from dealers and casino employees who'd witnessed the operation firsthand. Jack's defense team, led by Martin Kellerman, one of the most expensive criminal attorneys in the country, had an almost impossible task. They couldn't deny most of the evidence; it was too concrete. Instead, they employed a different strategy. Everyone else did it too. Kellerman argued that the casino industry in the 1950s and 60s operated with the tacit approval of Nevada state authorities. He showed how gaming commissioners had been wined and dined at the very casinos they were supposed to regulate. He demonstrated that skimming was so widespread it was essentially an industry standard. He painted Jack not as a criminal mastermind, but as a businessman operating within the accepted norms of his time. "My client is no saint," Kellerman told the jury. "But he's also not the devil the prosecution wants you to believe he is. He's a man who came from nothing and built something extraordinary in a city that specialized in moral ambiguity. If you're going to convict Jack Nolan, you have to convict Las Vegas itself." It was a bold strategy, and for a while it seemed like it might work. Then the prosecution called its star witness, Diane Nolan, Jack's ex-wife. The courtroom went dead silent when she walked in. Diane looked elegant, composed, and utterly determined. She'd been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, and she had plenty to say. She testified about envelopes of cash that appeared in their home safe, about meetings Jack held in their living room with men she recognized from FBI wanted posters, about offshore accounts he'd set up using her name, about the time Jack had come home with blood on his silver cufflinks and burned his clothes in the fireplace. Jack sat motionless through her testimony, his face a mask. But those who knew him well said they saw something break inside him when Diane spoke. This wasn't Danny betraying him for self-preservation. This was the woman he'd loved revealing his deepest secrets to the world. The trial lasted 8 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Guilty on racketeering, guilty on tax evasion, guilty on multiple counts of fraud, not guilty on a few of the conspiracy charges. But it didn't matter. The judge's stern man named Harold Webster, who'd seen countless Vegas operators parade through his courtroom, sentenced Jack to 25 years in federal prison. With good behavior, he might be eligible for parole in 12. Jack showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he'd always known. But before the marshals led him away, Jack asked to make a statement. The judge, perhaps recognizing the historical moment, allowed it. Jack stood, adjusted his silver tie, they'd let him wear his suit for the sentencing and address the courtroom. This city was built by men like me. We took a railroad stop in the middle of nowhere and turned it into the entertainment capital of the world. We brought jobs, revenue, glamour, and dreams to Nevada. Yes, we broke laws. Yes, we partnered with criminals. But we also built something magical. And now that the corporations want what we built, suddenly we're the villains. I accept my sentence. I even understand it. But don't pretend that Las Vegas is better off without men like me. The sanitized, corporate version of this city will have lights and shows and profits, but it won't have soul. Remember that when you're pulling slot machine levers in some glass tower owned by shareholders who've never set foot in Nevada. The marshals led him away. The silver suit disappeared through a courthouse door, and Jack Nolan vanished into the federal prison system. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The Mirage Palace was seized by federal authorities and eventually sold at auction. It changed hands 3 times before being demolished in 1978 to make way for a more family-friendly resort. The Silver Star and the Desert Crown met similar fates, absorbed into corporate entities, stripped of their character, eventually replaced. The Oasis, Jack's dream project, became a cautionary tale. It limped along for a few years under new management before filing for bankruptcy. It was purchased by a real estate developer who tore it down and built a shopping mall on the site. Today, tourists walk through that mall with no idea they're treading on the ruins of Silver Jack's last grand vision. Jack's fortune, everything he'd built over 30 years, was seized, liquidated, distributed. Some went to tax authorities. Some went to victims of his crimes, though defining who was a victim of a casino scheme operation proved legally complicated. Much of it simply disappeared into the machinery of federal asset forfeiture. His children, Elizabeth and Jack Jr., changed their surnames and distanced themselves from their father's legacy. They'd visit him occasionally in prison, duty calls that grew less frequent over the years. Jack understood. He'd poisoned his own family tree. In prison, Jack was a model inmate. He worked in the library, tutored younger prisoners, played cards, though never for money. That would have been against regulations, and kept to himself. The guards said he was polite, quiet, almost zen-like in his acceptance of his situation. But at night, lying in his cell, Jack would sometimes take out a small photograph he'd been allowed to keep, a picture of the Mirage Palace in its heyday, lit up like a diamond in the desert night. He'd stare at that photo for hours, remembering what it felt like to own a piece of paradise, to be king of his own kingdom, to wear a silver suit and believe he was untouchable. The desert had given him everything, and then it had taken it all back. But Silver Jack's story wasn't quite over yet. There was one more chapter to be written, though few would ever hear it. In 1984, after serving 15 years of his 25-year sentence, Jackson, Silver Jack Nolan, was released on parole. He was 61 years old. His hair had gone completely gray. His hands trembled slightly from a neurological condition he developed in prison. The silver suits were long gone, replaced by cheap slacks and button-down shirts bought at a discount store. He looked like any other retired man. The ghost had become truly invisible. Jack was released with conditions. He couldn't return to Nevada, couldn't enter any casino anywhere in the United States, couldn't associate with known criminals, and had to check in with a parole officer monthly. His fortune was gone. His properties were gone. His reputation was gone. He moved to a small apartment in Phoenix, Arizona, close enough to Nevada to still feel the desert heat, far enough to comply with his parole conditions. He got a job as a bookkeeper at a small trucking company. The owner had no idea who Jack really was. He'd applied under his legal name with a resume that made no mention of casinos or empires. For a while, Jack simply existed. He went to work. He came home. He ate TV dinners and watched the news. He was so ordinary that his neighbors barely noticed him, the elderly man in 3B, who kept to himself and always paid his rent on time. But you can't erase 30 years of history. And Las Vegas doesn't forget its kings, even fallen ones. In 1987, a journalist named Rebecca Valdez tracked Jack down. She was writing a book about the mob's influence on Las Vegas and wanted Jack's perspective. At first, he refused. But Rebecca was persistent, and eventually, Jack agreed to a series of interviews with the Dindinke, condition that nothing would be published until after his death. Those interviews, later published in 1998 as Silver in the Desert, the Jack Nolan story, revealed a man struggling with his legacy. Jack was by turns proud of what he'd built, ashamed of the violence he'd enabled, philosophical about the inevitability of his downfall, and bitter about how he'd been betrayed. But the most revealing moment came when Rebecca asked him if he regretted his choices. Jack was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I regret hurting my family. I regret the men who disappeared into the desert, even the ones who deserved it. There were better ways. But do I regret building those casinos? Creating those jobs? Giving people the thrill of a lifetime at the tables? No, I don't. I was the desert, Rebecca. I was Nevada before it put on a corporate suit and pretended to be respectable. I was real, and real things cast dark shadows." Jack died on February 12, 1991, of a heart attack in his Phoenix apartment. He was 68 years old. His death went largely unnoticed, a small obituary in the Phoenix paper, a slightly longer one in the Las Vegas Review-Journal, that focused more on his crimes than his achievements. His children arranged a modest funeral. About 20 people attended. Danny Roth, who testified against Jack but had also saved his life with that warning cane and stood at the back, silent and haunted. Diane did not attend. Jack was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Arizona desert by a funeral home employee who had no idea who Jack had been or what he'd represented. But here's the thing about legends: they don't die with the man. They grow, they transform. They become something bigger than the truth. In the years after Jack's death, his story became part of Vegas mythology. Old-timers in casinos would tell tales about Silver Jack to young dealers, stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. He became a symbol of the old Vegas, the dangerous, exciting, authentic city that existed before corporations sanitized everything. Documentary filmmakers became interested. Historians wrote articles analyzing his impact on Nevada's gaming industry. Conspiracy theorists spun theories about the money that was never recovered, supposedly millions hidden in offshore accounts that Jack took to his grave. In 2003, a small plaque was installed on Fremont Street near where the Silver Spur once stood. It reads, "On this site stood the Silver Spur Casino, 1943 to 1957. one of the establishments that helped transform Las Vegas into the gaming capital of the world. Jack's name isn't on it, but those who know the history understand whose ghost haunts that spot today. If you talk to the old dealers, the retired pit bosses, the descendants of Jack's contemporaries, you'll hear conflicting opinions. Some call him a visionary who understood Vegas before anyone else. Others call him a criminal who poisoned the city's reputation. Some say he was both, and that maybe those things aren't as contradictory as they seem, because the truth is, Las Vegas is built on paradoxes. It's both dream factory and trap. It's both liberation and destruction. It promises you can win while guaranteeing you'll lose. And men like Silver Jack Nolan, complicated, ruthless, visionary, criminal, were perfectly suited to build such a place. The corporations that own Vegas now prefer to forget men like Jack. They want you to think of Vegas as family-friendly entertainment, as legitimate business, as clean fun. But on certain nights, when the desert wind blows down the strip and the neon lights flicker just right, you can still feel it, that old energy, that dangerous promise, that sense that beneath all the polish and pretense, Vegas is still the city that Silver Jack and men like him built. The house always wins. But sometimes, the memory of the man who built the house lasts longer than the house itself. Sound of wind across empty desert, distant slot machines, a final shuffle of cards. Silver Jack Nolan was never going to be remembered fondly by everyone. He was a criminal, after all, a man who stole, who corrupted, who enabled violence. But he was also undeniably Vegas. He was the dream and the nightmare, the fortune and the ruin, the silver dollar that could be either luck or a chain around your neck. His empire is gone. His casinos are demolished. His wealth is scattered. Even his grave is unmarked desert sand. But his legend? That's still at the tables, still in the stories, still alive in the very DNA of Las Vegas. Because in the end, Silver Jack Nolan understood the fundamental truth of the desert. Everything eventually returns to dust. But some ghosts haunt the dust forever. Asterisk, and that's the story of Silver Jack Nolan, the Nevada Desert King, whose casino crimes built an empire and whose fall reminded everyone that in Vegas, the house always wins, even when you think you are the house. If you enjoyed diving into this dark chapter of American history, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We've got dozens more stories from the shadows tales of gangsters, outlaws, con artists, and empire builders who lived on the wrong side of the law, but on the right side of legend. Drop a comment below and let us know. What did you think of Silver Jack's story? Was he a visionary or just another criminal? And what gangster story should we cover next? The desert keeps its secrets, but we keep digging them up one story at a time. Until next time, remember, every fortune has a shadow. Every empire has a ghost, and in Las Vegas, the only sure bet is that nothing lasts forever.